Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for February 4th, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Jim Clausing and Matt Kaiser. I'm Brian Rexroad, and today what I think we'll do is start out with a look at some of the passwords that are being guessed out there, and I think we probably have a little more to talk about later on when we get to the Internet Weather Report. But Jim, what have we been seeing?
Yeah, Brian, a couple of weeks ago I did a story on the show about the top 10 passwords that some company was seeing, and that the password had dropped out of the top spot and was replaced by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Mm-hmm. So I figured it was time to go back and look and see what we're seeing. I've done this on the show probably 4 or 5 times now. The last time was about 5 months ago. So it was a good time to go and see what our honeypots have been picking up. And so just a quick refresher, we installed Kippo on this particular honeypot in 2011, and we've been capturing POP3 passwords on here since 2009. But we have had a big jump in the number of password guessing attacks we've seen against this honeypot since September. In September of 2013, in a little over 2 years, we had seen 380,000 guesses. We're up to 606,000 total attempts. So a huge jump in the numbers that we saw just in the last 5 months. So of those 606,000 attempts, and this was username and password combinations, were 92,690 unique combinations of these. Big jumps in both of those just since September, but just to look at some of the basic statistics we've looked at before, the left-hand column is the current guesses, and then compared to what we were seeing 5 months ago, 6 and 8 swapped spots at the top of the list, and they've done that a few times since we started tracking this. But most of the rest of the list was pretty consistent in the same order, although the percentages of, except for 8, the number of folks using guessing 8-character passwords went down some, but the percentages of the folks trying longer passwords increased above that. So the percentages for 9, 10, 12, 11, 12 all went up, and the shorter ones went down. So we are seeing more and more attempts to guess longer and longer passwords, except for the super long ones. Those over 55 characters in length actually got much smaller. We saw almost none in the last 5 months. Maybe 20 or 40 out of the 200,000 plus that we guesses that took place in that period of time. So the number over 55 characters, the percentage went down, and we still have not seen anyone guess any longer than 71, although in the last 5 months, we saw a couple more guesses that were 71 characters long. The top 10 passwords that we saw, password was still at the top. In fact, this order is identical for the first 9 to what we saw 5 months ago. Number 10 here, the 111111, flip-flopped with what was number 10 the last time, which was Katkuza or something like that. They were 10 and 11 this time. They've switched places. But again, the percentage of time that we saw these actually has decreased somewhat in the last 5 months. That report by the other group a couple weeks ago, they had seen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 move into the top spot. We haven't quite seen that yet, but the margin is getting narrower. And I didn't isolate just what we had seen in the last 5 months. I probably should have done that. Maybe the next time I do this report, I'll isolate it to just what was new. So this is still looking back over 2.5, almost 3 years worth of SSH passwords and almost 5 years worth of POP3 passwords.
it's probably important to make the distinction here. I think that other information was actual passwords in use, whereas these are passwords that
right.
Guessing, right?
Right. The other folks, their report was on passwords that they saw being used out of password breaches mostly, and we've done analysis of a couple of those in the past. I haven't done a recent one. I didn't get a full dump of all the Adobe passwords that were leaked, so I didn't bother trying to do that on those. Mm-hmm. And again, it's important to remind folks in this list of passwords, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the second most popular on our list, and it was the most popular on that other list. It also is worth noting that it is the default password in Kippo, and we haven't changed that on our Kippo installation on our Honeypot. So if they were doing automated guessing starting at 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, got up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they got in, they'd stop. So that may skew our results a little bit.
Perhaps you're touching on another point here. I guess two things. One is that contrary to what I guess I would describe as a well-administered system, we aren't restricting how many guesses can be performed. Is that right?
Right. This Honeypot will let you guess as many times as you want. It does not lock you out after 5 or, lock you out for a period of time after 3 or whatever. Now, this one will let you guess 100 in a row if you want.
Perhaps another bias that might exist here is, if I understand correctly, it's possible to at least get a pretty good idea that you're guessing against a Kippo platform, which could segment the types of guessers that are involved here.
Yeah, and it's something we've commented on before. I have not made any attempt to hide the fact that this is Kippo. If somebody took a look at the SSH string that gets passed, they could identify it that way. It doesn't. As I've said, I've made no attempt to hide it, and despite that, some of these password guessers still will get in there and will still try to do various things. They'll download their malware toolkits, and then they won't work because it isn't a real Linux machine that they're logged into. It's this emulated environment. But yeah, so there is definitely some bias in what we're seeing here. The top 10 base words, that is some variation on this, add things to the end or the beginning or whatever. This is fairly similar to what we saw 5 months ago. Password, test, root, admin, QWERTY, password with the @ and the 0 for the A and the O. These next two, the QAZ2WSX and QAZWSX, those are going down the first column with the left pinky finger and then the left ring finger if you're on a QWERTY keyboard. Change me, that was a default password for some service accounts for a long time, and some people use that as the initial password, basically telling the user the first time they log in they're supposed to change it, so that's one that's pretty common, and then pass.
I guess no one changed them.
Yeah. Well, or enough people haven't changed them that some of these automated password guessers are still trying them, and they must be having some success, or they'd take them out of their lists probably.
Right.
One of the other things that we always look at is, who puts, what years in their passwords. Because a couple of common ways of creating passwords are you stick the year on the end, or the current year on the end of or the beginning, or the year you were born on the end or the beginning, or year of some significant event. And so there's a little bit of change in these this time around, although 2011, 2010 are still at the top. 2013 moved up the list. 1979 dropped just off the list. And 2014 is now just off the list. The ones that still fascinate me, though, are 1989, 1985, 1982, 1979, 1988, 1984, that are all right there in the top 15, and I'm not sure if this is, years that folks were born, and a lot of users that are
1982. That's when I was born.
Oh yeah, okay.
No.
So a year before me, right? So anyway, that's just interesting numbers. Interesting statistic I like to look at. The password complexity here, we look at this every time too. At the top of the list is always just lowercase characters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the percentage that was just lowercase characters this time has dropped some, but that always seems to be what they try most, is simply lowercase characters, and then mixing in some lowercase characters and numbers, all numeric, mixing in the special characters. The number of them that satisfied our complexity rules, and here by complex we're saying they have to have uppercase, lowercase, digit, and special. The percentage of these actually increased somewhat this time, and the number of unique complex passwords took a big jump this time. So I don't know if that means that they think that the users that may be getting more conscientious about using complex passwords, and so they're guessing them more, or if just some on their pre-defined password guess lists just have more of them on there. Not sure really what that means, but the percentage is up a little bit. And then the other miscellaneous statistics that I always look at, the number that end with just a single digit is down a little bit. The number of passwords that end with 2 digits is about the same. The number that end with 3 digits is up a little bit. And the most popular final digit is still 3. And it's been that way, I think, every time I've run this report. The order has stayed the same from 5 months ago when I last did this, although the percentages are a little changed. But not sure what it is about 3, unless it's that folks do blah, 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 1, 2, 3 at the end. Mm-hmm. Since we had that other report a couple weeks ago, like I said, I thought it was a reasonable time to go back and see what we've been seeing in our honeypots. And not a whole lot has changed in what we're seeing.
Yes, absolutely. So, Jim, I'm kind of curious. Have you ever looked at the order in which the passwords get guessed?
I have looked a little bit in some of the raw logs. Mm-hmm. I've not done any real careful study of it and see if there's any interesting patterns in it.
It might be fun to take a look at that sometime, because I'm thinking in terms of if you were to only have the opportunity to guess a few passwords as opposed to the sort of unlimited set that are allowed here, what would be the first ones make? And you might surmise that the ones that are most popular are also the first ones, but only the statistics can tell you that for sure.
It's like playing Wheel of Fortune. Are the first 6 passwords RSTLNE and variations thereof?
Right.
There you go. So you have to check and see how many of those letters are in the first guess passwords.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what I didn't include here is the usernames. This is just an analysis of the passwords that are guessed, regardless of what username they're guessing.
Actually, good point. And in fact, one of the things that folks are going to want to look out for is the possibility, if you're managing a system that has a lot of accounts, look for the case where they're actually guessing using a handful of very simple passwords and then guessing across lots of usernames as an attempt to get into systems, because usually usernames aren't that well hidden, and will tend to be a little bit more overlap there. So.
Yeah, and what we do see in the raw logs, and I've got to figure out some way to present this maybe the next time I do this on the show, is there are certain passwords that will be guessed with particular usernames, and there are some passwords that will be guessed against multiple usernames.
Right.
And of course, since it's mostly SSH passwords that we see, The majority of the time, the username that they're trying against is root, a Linux box running SSH, and then some of the other ones, bin, Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, Tomcat, or some of the other ones that get guessed. But so that isn't really included in this analysis. Maybe I'll figure out a way to include that the next time.
All right, good. All right, thank you, Jim. So let's go to Matt. And Matt, the Gameover Zeus has been, I guess, one of those thorns in people's side, pretty prolific and kind of nasty. So I guess it's not getting any better, huh?
It is not. So recently, Gary Warner, who's been an excellent blogger on the Cybercrime and Doing Time blog, he posted about a new modification to the Gameover Zeus delivery system. He had a little bit of help from a few other researchers from GoDaddy, Dell SecureWorks, and Crisis Lab in Hungary, all big names. What's interesting about this one is that there are a few new samples coming out of the Gameover Zeus botnet, being distributed by Cutwhale, which regular viewers will know is one of the major spamming botnets in the world today. Cutwhale is it's sending out spam with a zip attachment. This zip attachment contains the Upetra downloader. I may be saying that wrong, but I've only ever read it. So, but this is a stub downloader, very small, and what it does is it'll pull down the Zeus binary. But what it's pulling down when it passes over the wire doesn't look anything like an executable file. It's got a .enc extension for encoded, I suppose, and it doesn't have any of the telltale signs that it's executable. If you're a malware analyst, you look for certain things when you're looking at the files. A particular header of MZ, Mary Zulu, usually designates that this is an executable file. What we're seeing here with this .enc file is that it has a header of ZZP, which really doesn't mean much of anything. Until you take a look at what the Upetra downloader is doing, it's actually decoding the entire ZZP type file, and it's really just a encoded binary with a 32-bit key. So what this means is that if you've got systems that look for binary files being downloaded over HTTP, it'll either look for the extension, which typically is exe or similar, or the MZ file header. And in this case, both of those have been obfuscated, and the contents of the file have also been obfuscated so that you can't take a look at it and say with any sort of heuristics or string matching that this is an executable file. So it's getting through a lot of the systems that are put in place to prevent malware from being downloaded. It's actually kind of interesting. One of the researchers, and I hope I don't butcher his name, Bodasar Benkath, actually published details of how the algorithm works. So if you want to, you can go ahead and build your own decoder based on if you have the Upetra downloader and the Zeus file itself, the .enc, you can unpack all of it. So this is the kind of thing I really like to see, this back and forth between malware researchers and virus writers, just to see what the new tricks are that are coming up with to bypass the defenses that are being put in place.
Yeah, very good, Matt. And, I think one of the things to kind of consider here is the motivation behind this, and that one of the targets for this type of malware is actually they tend to target the small to medium business predominantly. I don't think they're actually very scrutinizing about, I think they kind of spray it out to just about everywhere. But in terms of the type of transaction fraud that they're really trying to go after, password stealing activities, it seems that their tendency is to target that small to middle-sized business activity. And as more of those businesses are getting protections in place, I think what they're trying to do is find ways to get past those email protections, and once they get past those filters, they have the opportunity to perhaps exploit machines and do that password stealing activity.
Yes, exactly.
All right, very good. So let's go ahead back to Jim here, and I guess Jim, we strive to not fail, and so sometimes learning from other people's failures can be our best lessons.
My friend Jake Williams did a blog post over on his blog Malware Jake, I guess yesterday, entitled How to Fail at Incident Response. It made some good points that I'm not sure if we've discussed them on the show. I know we've talked about them amongst ourselves in the past. But in this case, he was talking about recently the Syrian Electronic Army compromised the UK sites of PayPal and eBay. And when the organizations were responding, they unfortunately used some compromised communication channels. And so the bad guys were aware of what the responders were doing and apparently tweeted about it. And so it was just a good reminder from Jake about, in your incident response plans and your disaster recovery plans, you need to give some thought to out-of-band communication and the fact that in a compromised situation, the bad guys may have compromised your email or your VoIP system, so you don't want to necessarily rely on those when you're coordinating your response. Or in a disaster recovery kind of situation, they may just be down, and so you need to think about other ways of communicating in those kinds of scenarios. So I thought it was just a really good reminder that these kinds of issues need to be considered when you're developing your incident response plans and your disaster recovery plans.
Yeah, absolutely true. You'd mentioned the VoIP systems. Another one to perhaps consider is, reservationless teleconference systems don't really force a password change or an access code change for each visit, whereas if you use a reservation bridge, it does give you a unique passcode for those. So those kinds of scenarios are useful, or ones that you want to consider as well. Again, in incident response activities, or anytime you're particularly concerned about the security of your collaboration, you want to look at perhaps an out-of-band method that isn't going to be as easily compromised. And I just want to make one quick comment. I don't think you intentionally did this, but we don't want to give these attacker groups any more credit than they deserve. This is alleged activity that there is always that possibility that what they tweeted was somewhat crafted, but the evidence kind of suggests that perhaps it was in fact captured.
Yeah, and not to pick on them, this has happened with other. I am aware of cases where the bad guys were watching, some of this communication from previous experience. So I know it happens. This is the one that Jake happened to mention it in his blog. So yeah, I don't know any of the details about it, and it's so alleged is a good point to make. But one of the other things that Jake mentioned in here that I think is worthwhile considering is, he talked about using prepaid cell phones for particular incident response roles rather than individual people, so that as people take their shifts, you hand off the cell phone, and that number is the one that's given out for people to call in these kinds of situations. So anyway, it was just a good reminder, and he made some good points in the post, so I recommend that folks go and take a look at it. And I loved the title, too, How to Fail at Incident Response.
Absolutely. I guess one final comment on this is that, there are a lot of collaboration tools that are out there today that are potential solutions to getting a lot of that interaction, which tends to be over email, into a means that's a little better to protect or a little easier to protect. One of the things you tend to see with email is that it not only could potentially be compromised, but in the end, you're really kind of spraying information around to a lot of places that it doesn't necessarily need to be. Whereas if you get into a collaboration environment, it gives the opportunity for responders to kind of pull the information, subscribe to it, and be in a position to get the information they need and not get overwhelmed with a bunch of garbage.
Sure. Yep. And it also means that if your email inbox fills up too quickly, there's a chance some things that might be useful a few months down the road get deleted. But if you have it in a collaboration system like you're mentioning, it's tracked for posterity.
Yep, absolutely. All right, very good. So, Jim, I guess we not only try to avoid incidents and mistakes, but we also try to avoid emergencies, but every once in a while you got to do something quickly.
Yeah, Adobe released a security bulletin today with an emergency patch to their Flash products. They're apparently seeing the bad guys exploit this in the wild, so they wanted to get it out in a hurry. The affected versions are Flash Player 12.0.0.43 and earlier on Windows and Mac, and 11.2.202.335. Don't worry about the version numbers, they're in the bulletin. And earlier for Linux. Since they are seeing the exploits in the wild, it is a good idea to update your Flash Player as soon as possible. If you're running Chrome or Internet Explorer 10 or 11 on Windows, apparently those will automatically update the Flash Player plugin. If you're not, you probably need to. But this is the Flash Player is something you need to be keeping up to date anyway. It seems like every vulnerability in there, that comes along, some of the bad guys manage to find a way to weaponize it in a hurry. So,
just a quick note on this, as you kind of sort of subtly pointed out there, it looks like they're on patch 44 for the Windows and Macintosh-based version of Adobe Flash Player. So if you're like me, you see a lot of requests to do updates on Adobe Flash, and this is one, as you pointed out, has been found to be exploiting in the wild, so you want to get that patch put into place.
Yep.
All right, very good. So let's take a look at the internet weather over the last week here, and the first one that I wanted to share with you is, I believe this is an entirely innocuous activity. This is actually scam probes on port 17,788 UDP. That port is associated with, it's not directly or officially registered to, but it's associated with PS Stream. And that's actually a Chinese peer-to-peer video application. I think there's actually an official site. I think it's pss.tv is the site associated with that. But in any case, all the indications here suggest that this is actually an innocuous change to the way the application is working. What we're seeing is actually a lot of sources activity that are basically U.S. domestic ones, but they're all pointing toward China, indicating that perhaps they're getting content from Chinese sources and are participants of that application. So, as I said, most likely innocuous. We keep an eye on these kinds of things to make sure that there isn't anything suggesting that it's not. But if you see this sort of activity, you might want to check and see if it is indicative of video streaming activity. Next one here is actually scan sources and scan probes on port 23 TCP. I think John Hogaboom perhaps reported on an aspect of this last week. I think it was actually this sort of block of activity that was taking place over here and just sort of starting on January 28th. What we're seeing is consistent with what you reported before, is that we've seen actually some very abrupt increases in the number of sources that are scanning on port 23 TCP. It seems to be trailing off a little bit over the last few days, but still consistent with what had been originally reported, that is most of the probes are from China and U.S. There are some U.S. sources with a variety of other countries involved in this, but in terms of the number of probes and the number of sources, both China and U.S. are at the top of the list and participating in the activity. So this is still being investigated to see if there are some other indications of things that we need to be paying attention to. And there's perhaps another one, we'll talk about port 22 later on, that doesn't appear to be related, but it does have some, being, port 23 Telnet and port 22 SSH tend to have some relationships, and as Jim had talked about earlier, a lot of these are password guessing attacks. Next one here is scam probes on port 8088. Actually, this shows UDP, but I think the actual activity is on TCP. That is originally registered to a RAN to HTTP, but it's since been basically moved to, or used most often as a proxy port. We're showing 30 days of activity here, and these are actually the probe activity here, somewhat pointed in nature, somewhat short and spiky activity, and almost exclusively from China. So the the suspicion here is that they're probing, looking for proxies that can be used for anonymization of other activities. And the next one here, scan probes on port 1777 TCP, and this is actually registered to a application called Power Guardian. Power Guardian is a company that provides backup power solutions, UPSs or uninterruptible power supplies being one of those. The probes in this case are from a single address in China. And this showed up, and I think John Hoagland had reported this as well, just showed up around the 26th of January, and we're still seeing that sort of spiky, somewhat targeted probing activity. And what I mean by targeted is it looks like they're picking out specific address blocks, scanning across that specific address block, and then coming back later for some other things. So it's not as random as you might expect for some of these probing activities that take place. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, rather unusual, but one that we'll want to take a little closer look at is the number of probes on port 22 TCP. This is SSH. Port 80 being a follower behind that, and then port 445, which usually is near the top of the list. And we also see port 23, we talked about that one already, and port 443 also follows suit. Actually, I neglected to point out that just behind port 445 is port 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database. Port 3389 is on here, being basically a remote desktop protocol. There are a couple other noise ones in there, but taking a little closer look at the port 22 activity, again, I think John Hoagland reported on this last week. He saw an upward trend in activity on the number of probes. This also consists of the number of sources that are probing on port 22 TCP. There was actually a quick uptick in activity right around the 29th of January, and we're continuing to see an upward trend. This is what I would describe as somewhat disturbing. The number of probes that are taking place here are up in the hundreds of millions per hour and continuing to increase. So it is very suggestive of something that is going awry, some sort of spreading activity or exploiting additional devices. So this one is continuing to be investigated. And the next one here, basically looking at the most sources doing probing activity. As usual, we see port 445 at the top of the list, followed by port 23 TCP. And then we also have port 80 TCP and port 8080 TCP showing up on here in terms of probing activity. That is the most sources doing probing activity. Other ports that are showing up are traditional and much cherished peer-to-peer protocol activity associated with the zero-access botnet. That's 16470, 16464, 16471, and 16465 UDP. So as you may be aware already, there were the takedown activity associated with the zero-access botnet. So presumably the command and control for zero-access has been pretty much taken out of service. And we are continuing to see a positive trend. And positive in this sense is a downward, basically a decrease in the amount of peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet. Though it does appear to be sort of trailing off in terms of the slope, the amount of decrease we're seeing. That's fairly typical for this type of thing, whereas early on, the antivirus starts to be able to catch up to the changes or provide detection and remediation tools for specific versions of malware. But eventually you get to the point where the user base that perhaps isn't running antivirus or has some other sort of problem hasn't really picked up on this and may not even realize that they're infected. And along those lines, by the way, we and a number of other organizations provide notifications to customers when we can identify who the victims are. But again, that only goes so far. Sometimes the victims are either unaware that they're being notified or aren't paying attention to the notifications, or perhaps are unsuccessful at being able to correct the problem. So in any case, we're still seeing a positive trend here. That is a downward trend in the amount of activity, but it does seem to be sort of tapering off. And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can contact us through email at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can also get in touch with us through Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel. That's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. You can subscribe to an audio-only version as well from iTunes. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim and Matt, for joining. I appreciate your inputs. And we'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.